The mountain rose before her like a silent challenge, its snow-capped peaks glinting in the crisp autumn sun. For Claire Weston, this was supposed to be the trip that proved something to herself, to the world, maybe even to the ghosts of her past. She had planned the hike for months, studying the trails, checking weather forecasts, and packing every ounce of confidence into her worn rucksack. It was a solo climb up Mount Vesper, a remote trail known for its unpredictable conditions and breathtaking views. The morning was perfect. The air was sharp and clean, laced with the scent of pine and frost. Orange and crimson leaves swirled across the forest floor as Claire started her ascent. The crunch of her boots on the gravel path echoed through the stillness, and for the first time in a long while she felt utterly alive. Her breath misted in the cool air, and each step felt like defiance against everything that had once held her back. At the ranger station, someone had warned her. "A storm's coming in tonight. You might want to wait a day." But Claire had smiled, too sure of herself, too hungry for escape. "I'll be quick," she'd promised. "Just up and back before sunset." But nature doesn't care about promises. By mid-afternoon, the blue sky had dulled to gray, and the wind began to whisper through the trees softly at first, then louder until the forest seemed to groan beneath its force. Flurries of snow began to drift through the air, melting on her jacket, then thickening into steady, blinding sheets. Claire's pace slowed as the world around her turned white. The trail markers vanished under layers of ice, and the once familiar path dissolved into a blur of rock and snow. Still, she pressed on. Just another mile, she told herself, though she had already lost track of distance and direction. Her breaths came faster now, shallow and uneven. The wind bit through her gloves, slicing into her fingers like glass. Somewhere in the storm, her compass slipped from her pocket, vanishing into the snow before she could even react. Panic flickered at the edges of her mind, but she swallowed it down. She found a small clearing and decided to rest, crouching beside a cluster of rocks to block the wind. She reached for her thermos, but her fingers were too numb to unscrew the cap. Her body trembled, her mind fogging with exhaustion and cold. Then, over the howling wind, came the most dreaded sound of all silence. Her portable heater, her lifeline, sputtered once, twice, then died completely. For the first time, Claire truly understood how alone she was. The snow thickened into a near whiteout, erasing the world around her. She called out, her voice barely audible against the storm's fury. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" Only the wind answered, carrying her words away. Her legs gave out and she sank to her knees, fear gripping her chest. The vastness of the mountain pressed down on her, a reminder of how small, how fragile she really was. Just as despair began to set in, something flickered in the distance, a faint, rhythmic light breaking through the snow. At first, she thought she was imagining it, a trick of exhaustion and fear. But then it came again, once, twice, a steady pulse, like a heartbeat in the darkness, a HEADLAMP. Someone else was out there. With the last of her strength, Claire shouted into the storm, waving her arms. The light paused, then began moving toward her. Relief and disbelief warred in her chest as she realized she wasn't the only one caught in the mountain's trap. When the figure finally emerged, through the swirling snow, a tall silhouette. Wrapped in layers of frost and determination, Claire felt tears sting her frozen cheeks. "Are you okay?" The stranger shouted over the wind. She could barely nod, but that tiny motion felt like salvation. In the midst of the chaos, two people strangers moments ago had found each other in a wilderness that could have swallowed them whole. The storm howled, relentless and cold, but for the first time, Claire wasn't afraid. That faint flicker of light through the snow wasn't just a headlamp, it was hope. And sometimes, on the most treacherous ascent, that's all it takes to survive. The snowstorm raged through the mountain like a living thing howling, relentless, alive with icy fury. The world around them had vanished into white, and Claire Weston could barely see the stranger's face through the blur of wind and snow. His voice, deep and steady, cut through the chaos. "We need shelter now." Together, they fought their way through the drifts until they found a small hollow carved into the rock, half hidden by snow-laden pines. It wasn't much, a shallow alcove shielded on 3 sides, but in that moment it was salvation. The stranger dropped his pack and immediately began working. "Name's Evan," he shouted over the storm. "You?" "Claire," she managed, her voice hoarse from the cold. "Claire," he repeated, as if the name itself anchored them both to something human amid the wilderness. They got to work without further talk. He cleared snow from the ground, using his small camp shovel to scrape out a pit while she gathered pine branches and dry twigs for insulation. Their fingers were numb, breath visible in harsh clouds, but their movements were purposeful. Survival was no longer an idea, it was instinct. When they finally had a makeshift lean-to propped between 2 rocks, they collapsed inside, shaking from exhaustion. Evan pulled out a small emergency blanket, splitting it in 2. "We'll keep the heat in better if we stay close," he said, matter of fact but gentle. Claire hesitated for only a moment before nodding. The storm howled outside, but beneath that thin silver blanket, they shared what little warmth they had hours past. The wind never ceased, but inside their fragile shelter, something began to change. The silence between them softened. Claire, still shivering, tried to distract herself from the cold by asking, "Why were you out here alone?" Evan chuckled low, tired, but real. "Stupid reason, honestly. Wanted to prove to my brother I could finish the Vesper Trail before winter hit. Guess pride runs in the family." Despite herself, Claire smiled. "I ignored the ranger's warning because I thought I was stronger than the weather. So I guess we're both idiots." He laughed, a genuine sound that warmed the space between them more than the blanket could. The night stretched on, endless and surreal. To stay awake, they told stories, bits and pieces of their lives. Claire spoke about city life, about always being the careful one who finally decided to take a risk. Evan shared stories of mountain rescues, of the people he'd guided through worse storms than this, and the one time he hadn't been fast enough to save someone. The shadows of those memories lingered between them, heavy but honest. Somewhere between fear and fatigue, laughter broke through. When Evan's attempt at melting snow in a tin cup resulted in spilled water all over his pants, Claire couldn't help it. She laughed until tears ran down her face. It felt strange, laughing when everything outside screamed danger, but it was exactly what they needed. In that sound, raw and human, they found courage. By the time the storm reached its peak, their shelter groaned under the weight of snow. They took turns reinforcing it, holding the poles, whispering reassurances neither of them truly believed but both desperately needed. Their bond, born of necessity, began to feel like something sturdier than the flimsy walls around them. When Claire's hands grew too stiff to move, Evan took them in his and rubbed warmth back into her fingers. "You're not giving up on me, got it?" he said. She looked up at him, eyes reflecting the faint glow of the lantern. "I wasn't planning on it." Outside, the mountains screamed. Inside, there was stillness, a fragile bubble of light and breath, and 2 people refusing to surrender. By dawn, the worst of the storm had passed. Their supplies were low, their shelter half collapsed, and their path uncertain. But something had shifted overnight. They were no longer 2 strangers trapped by circumstance. They were a team. When Claire looked at Evan, she didn't just see a rescuer. She saw resilience, patience, and quiet strength. And when he looked at her, he saw determination that refused to fade. Even in the face of the storm, they had found, in the heart of chaos, something both terrifying and beautiful. Trust born of survival. And though the mountain still loomed, Its dangers far from over, they both knew one thing with absolute certainty: neither would face it alone again. The morning after the storm dawned pale and muted, as if the world itself were recovering from the night's violence. Snow lay heavy across the land, untouched and glistening like shards of glass under a weak sun. For Claire and Evan, it was both beautiful and terrifying. The world had gone silent, and that silence carried a question neither wanted to voice. What if no one was coming? They had expected rescue by morning. Claire had fired the last flare, certain someone would see it. Evan had told her to rest, promising help was close. But as the hours stretched into another endless day, hope began to fray. The radio remained silent, the horizon empty. It became clear they were on their own dot at first. Despair tried to seep in. Claire caught herself staring at the snow, imagining how easy it would be to give in to the stillness. But then Evan's voice, firm but calm, grounded her. "We're not done yet," he said, packing snow into a pot to melt for water. "If no one's coming today, we make a plan for tomorrow." His steady presence anchored her. They began rationing what remained of their supplies, half a protein bar, a handful of nuts, and melted snow for tea. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Together, they reinforced the shelter, layering branches and scraps of tarp against the wind. Every movement was a reminder. Survival wasn't luck, it was partnership. As the day dragged on, their conversations began to shift. The talk of weather patterns, trail routes, and rescue timing faded into something quieter, something human. Claire told him about her students, how she'd taken the hiking trip after a heartbreak that had made her question everything. Evan listened, his expression softening. He admitted he hadn't guided anyone in nearly a year. After a tragic accident on another climb, he'd retreated to solitude, convinced the mountains were the only place he still belonged. "You came here to escape," she said gently. He nodded. "Guess I thought I could outrun ghosts. But turns out they pack light." Her laughter was unexpected but warm. In that moment, surrounded by snow and silence, she realized how easily honesty flowed between them. There were no walls left to hide behind, only truth and shared vulnerability. As daylight dimmed, the cold deepened again. They huddled close, speaking in low tones as the wind brushed against their fragile shelter. The rhythm of their breaths, the warmth shared between them, began to feel like something sacred. The fear that had once consumed Claire was replaced by something gentler, a strange, aching peace. The danger was still real, but no longer felt insurmountable. Every time Evan met her gaze, every time he checked her hands for warmth or brushed frost from her hair, she felt the shift happening inside her. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was connection. That night, as they lay side by side, the storm finally quiet around them, Claire whispered, "Do you think they'll find us tomorrow?" Evan hesitated. "Maybe. But if they don't, we'll manage. We've done it this long." She turned her head toward him. His face was faintly illuminated by the glow of the lantern, roughened by exhaustion but softened by the smallest smile. Something inside her fluttered, a fragile realization that had been building since the moment he'd appeared through the snow. The idea of rescue, once her only goal, suddenly carried a shadow of sadness. Because rescue meant leaving. It meant an end to this strange, beautiful bubble of trust they'd built in the wilderness. Claire wasn't sure when the shift had happened, perhaps during their laughter, or the night he saved her from despair, but she knew now. She didn't just feel safe with Evan. She felt seen. The next morning, as faint echoes of a helicopter hummed far away, she felt her heart twist. Relief warred with something else, a quiet longing that whispered, "I don't want this to end." For two souls who had only meant to survive, they had found something far rarer in the heart of the storm, a belonging neither had known they were missing. And though rescue was finally on the horizon, Both of them knew that once the world found them, nothing would ever feel quite as real as the silence, the snow, and the warmth they had discovered beyond the ordeal. The roar of the helicopter was deafening, but to Claire, it sounded like the end of a chapter she wasn't ready to close. After days trapped in the wilderness, the sight of rescue should have felt like salvation, but instead it felt strangely hollow. As the rescue team helped her and Evan climb aboard, she looked back one last time at the mountains, their white peaks glistening under the pale sun. That harsh, frozen world had nearly taken everything from them, yet it had also given her something she hadn't known she was missing. When they landed at the ranger outpost, the flood of noise, lights, and human voices felt overwhelming. Medics rushed toward them, wrapping blankets around their shoulders, asking questions, shining flashlights into their eyes. Claire barely responded. Her gaze kept drifting toward Evan. He was sitting a few feet away, surrounded by rescuers, but when their eyes met, the chaos seemed to fade. They didn't need words. The quiet understanding that had bound them through snow and silence was still there, steady and strong. But the world they'd returned to didn't understand what they'd shared. Reporters wanted stories of survival, not the quiet details of two strangers who'd become each other's hope. Friends and family wanted reassurances, proof that they were okay, but Claire struggled to explain that okay didn't feel right. She was safe, yes. Warm, fed, alive. Yet something vital felt missing. For days, she went through the motions: hospital checks, family visits, interviews, but every night she lay awake, hearing the phantom echo of wind against the shelter, the soft cadence of Evan's voice in the dark. Civilization felt loud, cluttered, artificial. Out there, stripped of everything, she'd felt real. Here, surrounded by comfort, she felt strangely adrift. Evan, too, found it hard to readjust. The mountains had always been his refuge, but after what they'd endured together, they no longer felt the same. He caught himself scanning crowds, half expecting to see her face. He missed the simplicity of their survival, two people relying on each other with complete honesty, without pretense or masks. He realized that what they'd built wasn't just born of desperation. It had been true. A week later, he showed up at the cafe where Claire had agreed to meet him. Neither of them quite knew what to expect. Would it feel forced? Would the bond they'd built in the storm fade under the fluorescent lights of civilization? When she saw him walk in clean-shaven, wearing a simple jacket instead of survival gear, her heart gave a startled jolt. For a moment, she saw the same man who'd held her through the longest night of her life, and her pulse quickened with recognition. They sat across from each other, coffee cups warming their hands, a silence stretching between them that felt more comforting than awkward. Finally, Evan smiled. "Guess this is our first real date," he said, the faintest trace of teasing in his tone. Claire laughed softly. "Strange, isn't it? We survived a blizzard, but this feels harder." He nodded. Maybe because there's no storm to hide behind. That simple truth hung between them like a promise. Here, in the ordinary world of clinking dishes and background chatter, they were no longer two stranded survivors. They were two people choosing to stay connected. They talked for hours not about the storm, but about their lives, their futures, and the quiet sense that they'd been changed by what they'd endured. Claire confessed that her old plans suddenly felt small. Evan admitted he was thinking about leaving guiding behind, maybe settling somewhere new. When they finally stepped outside, the world was calm. The sunset painted the sky in warm golds and pinks, a stark contrast to the cold whites of the mountain. Evan took her hand, tentative but sure. She squeezed back, and something inside her settled. The ordeal had stripped them bare, revealing the most essential parts of who they were. Now in this softer world, they were beginning again, not out of fear or necessity, but choice. The wild had tested them. Civilization would define them. And though the mountains now stood miles away, the truth remained simple and unshakable. They had survived together, and in doing so, they had found each other. Their journey wasn't over. It had merely changed form from a fight for life to a quiet, deliberate act of love. The mountain was quieter this time, gentler, even. The biting winds that once howled through the pass now whispered softly through the pines, carrying the faint scent of melting snow and pine resin. Claire stood at the base of the familiar slope, her gloved hands tucked into her jacket pockets, staring up at the place where everything had changed. 2 years had passed since the storm that had nearly claimed her life and, paradoxically, given it back to her. The memories were as vivid as the mountain air, the blinding whiteout, the desperate fight to survive, the fragile shelter where two strangers had found warmth in each other's arms. What had once been a scene of terror was now a sacred place, a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. And how, in that same moment, she had found something she never knew she needed. Behind her, Evan approached with that same sure-footed stride she remembered from their first moments together. Time had changed him too, his beard a little thicker, his smile easier. He carried a thermos in one hand and 2 cups in the other. "You're thinking too much," he said, his tone light but full of knowing. She smiled, taking a cup as he poured. The steam curled upward into the cold air, a comforting echo of that first fire they'd shared. "I can't help it," she replied softly. "It's strange, isn't it? To stand where we almost didn't make it, and feel nothing but gratitude." He nodded, his eyes scanning the ridge above. "Back then, I hated this place. Thought it'd haunt me forever. But now," he paused, looking at her, "it's where I found you." The simple truth of his words made her chest tighten. The past was no longer a scar. It was a beginning. Where fear and uncertainty had once ruled, love had taken root. Together, they had transformed that trauma into a story of resilience, courage, and deep connection. As they climbed the familiar trail, the silence between them was comfortable. The crunch of their boots in the snow marked a rhythm only they shared. They reached the ridge where their shelter had once stood, long gone now, melted into the landscape. Evan set his pack down and pulled out a small stone carving. It was rough, shaped like a heart, engraved with 2 initials, C+E. He placed it on the ground, half buried in snow. "A reminder," he said. Claire touched his arm. "Of what we survived?" He shook his head. "Of what we began." The wind stirred, lifting strands of her hair, and she smiled. "Then let it stay here where love started by accident and stayed by choice." They sat for a while, sipping coffee, watching the sun dip low behind the peaks. It painted the snow in soft pinks and golds, the same hues that had glowed in the dawn of their rescue. But now there was no fear in the light, only peace. They talked about how far they'd come, the months of healing, the slow rebuilding of normal life, and the new adventures that awaited them. Evan had opened a wilderness school, teaching others not just how to survive in the wild, but how to find themselves there. Claire had published a book about resilience and unexpected connection, her words touching people far beyond the mountain's reach. Together, they'd built something lasting, something grounded in the lessons the wilderness had taught them. "The world feels smaller now," Claire said thoughtfully. "But somehow I feel bigger." Evan smiled. "That's what happens when you stop running from life and start living it." They stood hand in hand as twilight deepened, the stars beginning to pierce the fading sky. The past stretched out before them, not a place of danger, but a living symbol of everything they'd overcome. "What's next for us?" Claire asked, her voice quiet but sure. Evan squeezed her hand. "Whatever comes," he said simply, "as long as we face it together." She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. The mountain that had once tested their strength now bore silent witness to their love's endurance. It was no longer a memory of survival, it was the foundation of a future, and as the first stars flickered into life, Claire realized something profound. Love, like the wilderness, was vast, unpredictable, and breathtaking. It wasn't about conquering storms, it was about weathering them together. From fear had come faith, from isolation had come intimacy, and from survival had come a love strong enough to last beyond the mountains. Their journey had begun with desperation, but it continued now as something infinitely greater, an enduring love story born in the wild, built in trust and carried forward by the quiet, unbreakable strength of two hearts that had found home in each other. 10 years later, the mountain still stood unchanged, eternal, its snow-dusted peaks cutting sharp against the pale blue sky. But at its base, life had bloomed anew. Where once the air had carried only wind and silence, laughter now drifted through the trees. Warm and alive, a small group of students, young hikers, and aspiring rescuers gathered near a wooden lodge built at the edge of the forest. Its sign read, "The Haven Trail School, founded by Evan and Claire Walker." Inside, Claire watched from the window as Evan demonstrated survival techniques to their latest class. His hair was a little grayer now, his movements slower but steady, still the mountain guide who'd once saved her life, still the man who made her feel safe in any storm. But the way he smiled at the students, patient and proud, made her heart swell all over again. Their daughter, Sophie, sat cross-legged beside the fire, sketching the view outside. She was only 7, with her father's eyes and her mother's curiosity. Every few minutes, she'd glance toward the ridge beyond the lodge, the one her parents had called the pass. To Sophie, it was simply a mountain. To Claire and Evan, it was sacred ground, the place where two lonely souls had found love in the harshest of conditions. When the lesson ended, Evan came inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. "They're learning fast," he said, wrapping an arm around Claire's waist. "Even the city kids don't seem afraid of a little cold." She smiled. "You've got a good way of making the wild feel like home." He kissed her temple. "I learned from the best." Later that evening, when the last student had gone to their cabin and the lodge had grown quiet, the two of them slipped outside. The air was crisp, just like that long-ago night, but now the cold no longer carried fear. They followed a familiar path up the slope, their boots crunching softly in the snow. The stars above were as bright as they had been on the night of their rescue, scattered like silver dust across the sky. Claire's breath fogged the air. "Do you ever think about how different everything would have been if the storm hadn't come?" she asked. Evan was quiet for a moment, gazing toward the ridge. "All the time," he admitted. "But I don't think it was the storm that changed us. It was what we decided to do afterward, how we lived." Claire nodded, understanding. "The mountain didn't just test us, it gave us a beginning." They reached the spot where their shelter had once stood. The heart-shaped stone still rested there, weathered by time but unbroken. Sophie had placed a small wildflower beside it earlier that summer, and though it had long dried, its stem remained a fragile symbol of life's persistence. Claire knelt beside the stone, brushing snow from its surface. "It's strange," she said softly. "This place once felt so endless, so wild. But now it feels like part of us." Evan crouched beside her, his gloved hand finding hers. "Because it is. Everything we built, the school, our family, it started right here." For a while, they stayed there in silence, wrapped in the peace that only comes after long journeys. The wind whispered through the trees, the stars shimmered above, and the world seemed to hold its breath around them. Claire looked at him, a smile curving her lips. "Do you think Sophie will love this place as much as we do?" He chuckled. "She already does. She asked me today when she can climb the ridge." "Just like her father," Claire teased, "and her mother," he added. Eyes warmed as they turned to head back toward the lodge. Claire looked over her shoulder one last time. The mountain stood silent and strong, its peaks glowing faintly under the starlight. It was no longer a place of survival. It was a story, a promise, a legacy. For them, love hadn't been born in candlelight or comfort, but in wind and ice, in fear and faith. And even now, years later, it endured, as steadfast and unyielding as the mountain itself, because some loves aren't fleeting, they're forged. Shaped by trial, strengthened by time, and meant to last through every season. And as they disappeared into the soft glow of their cabin, hand in hand, the wind carried only one truth through the trees. The storm had brought them together, but love had carried them home.